Today, we will feature two organizations in our journalism portfolio: the Investigative Reporting Program at Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and the Pulitzer Center, which supports global and domestic enterprise reporting. And we will be speaking with 4 journalists who were supported by these two institutions to report on COVID, as well as David Barstow, who leads the IRP at Berkeley, and Marina Guevara, who is the executive editor of the Pulitzer Center. COVID has altered all of our lives in so many ways, and similarly, it has impacted the practice and pursuit of journalism in numerous ways. Today, our focus is on the excellent reporting that was done despite the pandemic and the ways in which journalism was made better by the adaptations and new ways of working that were necessitated because of the pandemic. Our speakers will provide just a glimpse into how old rules and norms were appended in the journalism field, all for the better. So I first want to bring in Meiying, who has just completed an internship at the LA Times and continues to freelance for the LA Times and other outlets. At the beginning of 2020, Meiying, a graduate student at Berkeley Journalism, was focused on completing her own thesis project on HIV prevention in China. In fact, she was in China in January 2020 doing interviews, but in March, the investigative reporting class she was taking with David Barstow became a COVID reporting newsroom, and Meiying had to put her thesis project aside and dive into COVID reporting. In particular, with her bilingual skills, Meiying and her classmate did a stereotype busting story about San Francisco's Chinatown, a story that landed in the New York Times. So I want to turn to Meiying. Can you tell us about that story, what you reported, and why it was important to tell that story?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for having me. The story I reported on is about San Francisco Chinatown's early actions to avoid an outbreak when the pandemic hit. Many people avoided Chinatown as early as January 2020, thinking that the virus had already arrived in the neighborhood. But in fact, there were fewer than 5 cases in Chinatown, while outbreaks took place in other parts of the city last April. We tracked down the community's efforts, and we learned that a Chinese hospital located in the heart of Chinatown worked with the city and hosted a press conference about hygiene and social distancing in early February. That's earlier than other communities because they paid attention to what was happening in China. They learned from that. And also some of them experienced SARS, and they are kind of familiar with wearing a mask. So I worked on the story with a classmate and we divided up the work. I focused on interviewing local Chinese media outlets like a radio station and a newspaper. I interviewed a Wuhan University Alumni Association that donated to Chinese hospital. And I interviewed local restaurant workers in Mandarin and Cantonese to figure out a timeline on when and how they spread the word about hygiene and social distancing within the community, not just the press conference, but actions each group took in the process. I think the story is important because it shows that it's possible to keep the virus at bay when the community works together, wear masks and wash hands. And it shows that people's assumptions about Chinatown were wrong. And at the time, anti-Asian attacks were surging already. We also produced a TV version of this story for PBS NewsHour, hoping that more people see it. My personal takeaway is that for stories like this, we need the linguistic skills and cultural understanding to pursue it, to know how to find the sources and to even know what questions to ask. I think Berkeley's collaboration with major news outlets definitely made telling stories like this one possible. But I hope more newsrooms will value these stories and work with journalists with diverse backgrounds to tell them.
Thank you, Meiying. And we put her stories in the chat, and I hope people will read them and think about the dates in which they were published, because we knew so little and there was so much misinformation going around, especially about the Chinese community. And so I hope people will look at that in the chat. Let me bring in your classmate, Danielle Lempres, who also participated in Berkeley's COVID newsroom effort. Daniel is currently a researcher and reporter with the Investigative Reporting program, having just graduated from Berkeley Journalism. But seems like they couldn't let you go, Daniel, because you've stayed on and you're continuing with several major investigative projects. So Daniel, like Meiying, you also worked on a groundbreaking COVID story that was published in the New York Times in the summer of 2020 about the impact of stay-at-home orders on the ability of child welfare caseworkers to check in on vulnerable children. Like a lot of government agencies, I imagine that the child welfare system is not easy to unlock and investigate. And I also remember from the spring and summer of 2020 that this was not a topic on the minds of most Americans or newsrooms, which is why I think it is so noteworthy. Tell us how you and your colleagues came to pursue this story, and more importantly, what impact it had.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm really happy to be here. So when the pandemic started, I was placed on a reporting team with 3 other students and IRP reporter Garrett Therolf. Garrett has covered child welfare in California for over a decade, but for most of us, this was our first experience covering it. That meant learning how these 58 county-run agencies worked before the pandemic, what changes the coronavirus was having on them, and under whose guidance those changes were being made. This sort of on-the-ground learning is especially difficult when dealing with child welfare. Access to information can be hard to get, and the pandemic further complicated things. Agencies were permitted to delay records requests and had a ready excuse to avoid interviews. Even so, it became clear pretty quickly that these changes could have fatal side effects for children suffering from abuse or neglect. Investigation deadlines were loosened, face-to-face interactions were curtailed, and in some counties, as much as 1/3 of the workforce went out on leave as schools closed and the pandemic worsened. Timelines implemented to save lives were extended around the state, leaving children vulnerable. And child abuse investigations were being conducted over the phone, which experts told us is dangerously ineffective. We knew this could have deadly consequences. So the question became, has it already led to the death of a child in California? And that question led us to Aiden Braden. Aiden was born in Fresno in late February of 2020. He was first reported to local child protective services at 2 days old. 38 days later, Aiden died under suspicious circumstances. Agency records reflected a lackluster investigation, mostly composed of unanswered and unreturned phone calls. And agency leadership cited short staffing and the pandemic when asked what went wrong. In terms of the impact this reporting had, some of these guidelines were changed the day after we requested comment from the state, which is a remarkable experience for a young reporter to have. After the story published, we heard from social workers around the country, some of whom were just happy someone was paying attention. At the IRP, we're lucky enough to be able to pay attention when others can't. We're able to spend months on projects and really go to school on what we're writing about. That time means we can listen in a way deadline pressure doesn't always allow. We have the time to make that 101st phone call or run down that tip that other reporters passed on. We have the time to request records and then probably even more records, which is a luxury most reporters don't have. Before the IRP, I mostly did daily news where it's not unusual for a story to run even though questions remain unanswered and uncertainty persists. Long-term projects and collaborations allow us to answer every question and usually do so in a definitive way. That foundation allows for some really impactful reporting. I learned a lot about how to approach a new subject, and I think most importantly, I learned that there's a confidence that comes from deeply understanding your subject matter, and that confidence is attainable. Most of this year for me was defined by a sense of helplessness, hiding from a virus wreaking havoc, seeing plans we made and worked towards slip away, watching George Floyd beg for his life, and the steady stream of reporters of color who spoke out about problems in their newsrooms, they all made me feel helpless. It really felt like the only thing in our control was the reporting. I tried to remind myself that the helplessness I was feeling was one many system-impacted people feel day after day, and thinking that this reporting might help them definitely helped me as the weeks at home became months at home. The last thing I'll say is just that this project could not have been done without the incredible hard work and passion of the reporters and staff at the IRP. When a story takes this much time and this much work, it can only be accomplished by really committed and very well supported journalists. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel. I think you just said so beautifully in a few minutes why the MacArthur Foundation supports investigative reporting, because it truly is something that takes a lot of time, and to give reporters the luxury of time to pursue those deep stories is so incredibly important. So thank you for sharing that story with us. And like Meiying, you can see Daniel's story in the chat. So let me bring in David Barstow, who doesn't really need an introduction, 4-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who joined Berkeley Journalism faculty in 2019. Meiying actually told me this lovely story about how one of your first classes was oversubscribed, and despite your best efforts to weed the students out, that you ended up letting them all stay. And not only did you let them all stay, but you helped them get their work published in a lot of major news outlets as students, which is incredible. So David, tell us, what are you, and I know the new dean of Berkeley Journalism, Geeta Anand, what are you two trying to do at Berkeley Journalism, along with other faculty, of course? And how did COVID make possible something that hadn't been done before? And how are your students part of the changing culture of journalism?
Oh gosh. So yeah, I remember my students actually shouting me down and saying, "You can't cut us off. You can't limit this class." That was my introduction to Berkeley and the passion of our students. I think we all agree here that the world is in desperate need of more skilled investigative reporters, and especially from communities that have long been marginalized or overlooked. And this has been the failure of investigative reporting in particular to really reflect the world that we cover has had catastrophic consequences for this country for many decades. And so I came to Berkeley because I wanted to do all that I could to change who gets to become an investigative reporter. And that's something that Geeta, our dean, also, the two of us share this passion. And I came hoping to encourage as many Daniels and Meiyings to fall hopelessly head over heels in love with investigative reporting. And our big bet at Berkeley Journalism is that the best way to do this is to challenge our students to execute and publish investigative stories of their own conception, right? To actually have ownership of these stories, and to really absorb what it feels like to publish hard facts about people in power, and to absorb what it feels like to give voice to people who and communities who would otherwise suffer in silence. And so our entire focus has been pushing our students to produce journalism of the highest quality. And this is where COVID came in. I mean, this was such a total catastrophe and crisis that it suddenly opened up, just from sheer necessity, all of these new opportunities for our students to just jump into the deep end and to show their stuff. And so when the lockdown happened last March, I vividly recall how Berkeley Journalism, we essentially turned ourselves into a virtual newsroom within a span of a week and formed a partnership with the New York Times, for heaven's sakes, to cover how the pandemic was impacting the state of California. And we had, within the span of a week, we had 80 students and we had 20 faculty, and we had carved up the state, and you had Meiying looking at Chinatown, you had Daniel looking at the child welfare, and on and on and on it went. And over the span of the next 6 months or so, we had roughly 50 of our students published in the New York Times. And then an interesting thing happened. And this is why I think the COVID catastrophe has had a kind of an accelerating shift on other big changes taking place in journalism. And that is, all of these other news outlets were seeing what our students were doing in the New York Times, and they came knocking. and said, well, wait a minute, how do we get some use of these students? And it was not just the New York Times, it was the LA Times, it was Frontline, it was Inside Climate, it was the Marshall Project, on and on and on. And the bottom line, and this is what excites me the most, is that in the last 18 months, the investigative reporting program has helped 93 of our students get published in 29 different news outlets, and stories of real significance, like the two stories that have been highlighted here today. And I think it's because, you know, the big first wave of collaboration that happened between the ProPublicas of the world and news outlets is now morphing into sort of a second wave of collaboration that realizes and recognizes that our students, not just at Berkeley, but students at other journalism schools as well, can play very meaningful roles in the coverage that's being done in a whole host of news organizations. And I think that's super exciting, and that's why I'm so happy that you've given us an opportunity to talk about this today.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate those comments. And I know that Berkeley Journalism is trying very hard to make sure that the student body, the young reporters that you're recruiting, reflect America. And I want to shift to a conversation about representation as I bring in my next speaker. So at MacArthur, we care very deeply about diversifying the journalism profession because our goal is to create more accurate and nuanced and complete news and narratives. And when a newsroom staff includes a range of identities and lived experiences that are reflective of the American population, I think we get closer to that goal. So on that note, I'd like to bring in Sylvester Brown, who is currently with the St. Louis American, the largest Black-owned weekly newspaper in Missouri. He is a Deaconess Fellow, which is a program supported by the Deaconess Foundation, a local foundation that works for racial equity in the St. Louis area. Sylvester and Valentina, who we will hear from in just a moment, received one of the coveted grants from the Pulitzer Center last spring to pursue reporting collaborations on COVID-19. Sylvester, welcome. You are part of a team.
How are you?
You are part of a team working on the 63106 project.
Yes.
Tell us about the 63106 community and what you and your colleagues wanted audiences to know and understand about the impact of COVID on this community.
Well, my former editor with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Dick Weiss, started an organization, a nonprofit called Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson, which the Pulitzer Center funds. Out of that, when COVID struck, he decided to start the 63106 project. 63106 is one of the poorest zip codes in the city of in the St. Louis region. Healthcare access, people living on subsidies. It's just, you know, all the disparities and all the problems this zip code deals with. So 63106 is a racial equity storytelling process. And I like, you know, what David said about investigative journalism. I feel his passion on that. But I share that passion with storytelling. And that's what Dick set out to do. He set out to hire writers. We're called storytellers. Most of us are people of color. And he wanted us to go in there and tell stories, not our stories, but the stories of the people who were impacted. So because we were talking to this demographic, we were able to go beyond the stereotypes, beyond the statistics. We actually talked to people who were dealing with diabetes and all the pre-existing conditions that make COVID worse. We talked about what it's like to deal with these issues and to deal with COVID on top of that. We talked to people who had no idea how to access healthcare because there's such a lack of healthcare facilities and information in these communities. So they told us what it was like trying to get to the hospital, trying to get a loved one who was showing symptoms to the emergency room. So that was the beauty of this project, focusing on this zip code and allowing us to go in there and tell stories, tell their stories. I think that storytelling goes back to the griots of Africa. And I can't stress enough how important it is to let people share their own experiences. And you're just there to gather information and put it in a story form. So that's about it in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you. And Sylvester, while I was doing research for this and reading the different stories that you and your colleagues have written, I came across a very personal essay that you wrote entitled 63106 and Me, in which you wrote, "In me, my neighbors have a narrator who can listen with understanding and empathy. In me, readers have someone who very much knows the territory." When we spoke the other day, you and I, you shared with me this sort of non-linear path that you've traveled to become a writer or storyteller.
Yeah.
Tell us why empathy and familiarity are important in telling these human stories.
Yeah, I like I said, I took a non-linear, non-traditional approach to journalism. I started a magazine in 1987 that I thought was like Mother Jones of The Guardian. Because of that publication, not only did we win a bunch of awards, but I met people in the community. And I was raised in poverty. I dropped out of high school, back and forth with different jobs and different economic issues. So I wasn't talking to strangers. I was talking to people who reflected my life. And I guess I built up a lot of trust in the community. So being able to go to someone and asking them to tell personal stories, asking them to really go deep. I think trust is very important, but also racial identity. Someone who looks like me, someone who may have experienced my life experiences, asking me these questions. So I'm going to give them a little bit more than I may give, a white journalist from a major main newspaper. So yeah, that was the gist of that, the importance of that.
Mm-hmm. Again, we have put a link up to some of those stories, and I really encourage folks to take a look at Sylvester's work and also his personal essay. Thank you so much. Okay. Now, let me turn to an international context. Valentina Oropeza is an investigative journalist based in Caracas, Venezuela. Her digital news outlet, Prodavinci, is the premier digital outlet in Venezuela for explanatory journalism. Valentina also received a COVID news collaboration grant from the Pulitzer Center, but she and her colleagues face some very basic challenges to their reporting. Venezuela was already in the midst of a humanitarian crisis when COVID arrived. There was no electricity, no internet, no gas. So they had to get very creative, both to do their news gathering, but also to get the accurate news and information out to the public. Valentina, welcome. Please tell us the situation that confronted you and your colleagues at the outset of this pandemic.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for having me and for having us in representing Prodavinci. When the pandemic started, Venezuelans were already very weak after at least 5 years of crisis. And when I say crisis, I mean—
Hey, Kathy, just wanted to say hi.
Get muted.
Valentina, you are muted.
Oh.
Do you want to roll back?
Okay, go back. You're listening to me now?
Yes, go back.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I was saying that when the pandemic started, Venezuelans were already very weak after at least 5 years of crisis. And when I mean crisis, I would like to refer to hunger and limited access to medicines and health assistance, right? So our main challenge was to cover the impact of the COVID-19 on the humanitarian emergency, but without remaining trapped by the limitation of that emergency, right? What do I mean by this? Well, first, Prodavinci is a digital media outlet in a country with severe internet access limitations due to the blackouts. Second, the authorities haven't provided reliable health data for many years now. And in the third place, many people fear that confinement would be used to exercise more political and social control over citizens, not only for the purpose of controlling the transmission. And that would, of course, impose more difficulties in the task of reporting a story for us. So what did we do? What resources did we have in our hands to deal with this? Well, in the first place, a reporting based on storytelling. we were trying to create narratives that could engage the reader and create empathy. Second, we had our own data gathering and very powerful visualizations. We also had experts that could provide accurate information on COVID, on the situation of the country. We had 7 local allies, 7 local media outlets to expand the distribution of our content. We also had the commitment to educate our audiences with scientific facts and updates about COVID. And of course, we had the support of the Pulitzer Center, which was fundamental to achieve our goal of covering the pandemic. And at this point, I'd like to remember that our name, Prodavinci, was chosen in reference to Leonardo da Vinci, this great figure of the Renaissance. Why? Because Prodavinci aims to bring enlightenment and knowledge to this obscure, very political, dark and political and social moment that we're facing now in Venezuela for a while. For this purpose, we focus the coverage on 4 main lines. We cover public policies, the analysis of medical treatments, human rights, and the protection of children. And one of the main tools that we had to do so was explanatory journalism. The first content that we published with the support of the Pulitzer Center was How Epidemics End, which was an explainer that told our readers what an epidemic is, how they are measured, or how they are studied. I think Natalie can share with you the link in the chat. We also created Academia Prodavinci, or Prodavinci Academy, which is a program that transforms journalistic pieces into study guides for teachers and students. And these guides can be downloaded from our website. Over 7 months last year, we had 131 pieces published by these 7 allies that work with us. And one of the most important of them was Boss TV, which is a group of young journalists and college students that use our contents to create posters. And they located these posters in public places, such as bus stops or the entrance of markets, so that people that didn't have internet connection could read this material, right? So this collaboration allowed us to reach offline audiences, which was very important for us at the moment. We also had the collaboration with the Public Information Service, which is a group of Venezuelan journalists that deliver the information through WhatsApp, especially for migrant communities. As you may know, we are the main focus of migration in the Americas right now. And WhatsApp is a main source of information for Venezuelans now, because since people have so many restrictions to get information, they believe in their relatives and friends. So they don't question whether the things that they receive in WhatsApp are true or not. So that imposed like an extra duty on journalists regarding the fact checking of all these messages that we are getting through WhatsApp, right? One of our main takeaways is that the collaboration is fundamental in a context like ours. In this coverage, we had a story about journalists that were arrested while they were trying to report on the condition of hospitals and centers where COVID patients were receiving medical attention. So going together, all this local media made us stronger regarding censorship. I think that's it.
Thanks, Valentina. There's so much there. You touched on so many different topics, and I really appreciate that. And hopefully we can return to some of those in the Q&A. We are putting, again, work that Valentina and her colleagues did in the chat. Please look that up. A lot of great stories there. And really so much, even though the Venezuelan context is very different, given the crisis the country has faced, at the very local level and at the level of human pain and suffering, and misinformation and disinformation spreading, I think there's a lot of lessons learned for the US domestic context as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Let me bring in Marina Walker-Guevara now, who is the executive editor of the Pulitzer Center and formerly deputy director of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, which brought us the Panama Papers. Marina, you spearheaded these COVID-19 reporting collaborations for the Pulitzer Center, which, by the way, attracted 500 proposals last year. Why did Pulitzer decide to send out this collaboration challenge? And what did you learn from the 75 projects that you did end up supporting?
Thank you so much, Kathy, for inviting me along with these amazing colleagues. As you said, I wanted to share that when I joined Pulitzer Center, I had been 5 weeks on the job when the pandemic started. And these worldwide lockdowns happened. And we looked a little bit at one another through Zoom and thought, what we do now? And I was fortunate to be able to lean on the experience that I brought from ICIJ, where for 15 years, my job was to persuade lone wolf investigative reporters to instead embrace collaboration and radical sharing. And so we quickly said, you know what, we're going to put collaboration at the center of our COVID response. And we challenge our grantees to overcome any limitations or restrictions that they were experienced through radical collaboration. We defined it broadly, collaboration across newsrooms, collaborations across borders, and even collaboration across areas of expertise and disciplines. We sat tight and waited for the response. And as you said, we were flooded with proposals. We were able to support many of them, more than 70. And the depth and the impact of the work was stunning. I want to highlight 3 outcomes looking at this universe of 75 projects. What stood out? What stood out was that who tells the story really matters. And it matters always, but it matters greatly when we are in a public health crisis of global proportions. So to be able to see how these collaborations put on the spotlight the role of the local journalist. The local journalist everywhere that unfortunately not always has been treated well or respected by media, by national or global outlets, and to see how those local reporters really were the heroes in the pandemic coverage because of the access that they enjoyed, because of the community roots, and because of their expertise. Just as an example that comes to mind, a project we supported that brought together in an unprecedented way the New Yorker magazine, a film production house in New York, and the Navajo Times, which is the newspaper that serves the Navajo Nation. The project focused on the response to COVID-19 in the Navajo community and the role of those journalists in delivering crucial information. The documentary is called The People's Newspaper, and I recommend that people take a look and to really focus on how that could not have been possible without the guidance and the expertise of the Native American reporters who participated in that film. Second point, we saw a lot of innovation and explorations of new forms of reporting and new forms of storytelling. And I say, maybe it was out of necessity. I think it was out of diversity. These collaborations led to much more diverse teams, and that diversity also brought diversity of skills. So suddenly journalists found themselves working with colleagues that had skills that they never had in their newsroom. An example is Mission Local, and a local bilingual outlet in the Mission District in San Francisco, covering the Latino community. And for the first time, they were able to team up with animators and with illustrators and created these beautifully illustrated animated videos to represent the experience of the Latino community during COVID. The community loved it, and the local high school also loved it. So they invited the journalists to come to the classroom and for an entire semester work together on what they called, let me remind myself the name, the Pandemic Storytelling Project, where students and teachers and journalists use illustration, audio, and animation to talk about what they were going through in the pandemic. For us at the Pulitzer Center, where our mission is journalism and education, when a project comes full circle that way, it's kind of like an amazing moment. And the last thing I would say, the last insight, is how collaboration also leads to more sustainable reporting, sustainable business. We talk about the quality of the journalism, but we also need to remember that these enterprises, they need to survive. An example that comes to mind is the North Carolina News Collaborative. Is a collective of 22 newspapers that during the pandemic decided that instead of all chasing the same story and wasting resources and duplicating efforts, they would come together and they would work together on bigger, deeper stories. So with one of these grants, they hired a coordinator and investigations editor who brought them together, helped them surface stories, and helped them find opportunities for collaboration. So here's like legacy newspapers that were able to overcome old ways and aspire to more ambitious stories. So those are 3 insights, and there's much more that we can discuss in the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Marina. I know that you have, as we noticed, 75 examples that you could share with us. And I encourage folks to look on the Pulitzer Center website and look and explore those many different stories. The headline for this talk is about, the spread of collaboration, which, in an industry that was previously very, 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 very competitive, who gets the first scoop, that's a change of culture. But the other thing that's happening right now, there's a very active conversation about objectivity. And that's another time-honored, precious value in the journalism space. And I think all of our speakers, but in particular, Meiying and Sylvester, kind of their examples show us that the closeness, the familiarity is really an asset. And that maybe previously, newsroom leaders may have said to them, you're too close to the story, you're too biased, you can't tell that story. And what they've shown us is something very different. Meiying and Sylvester, do you want to come in and say a little bit about that closeness and where you felt like that really was an asset for you?
Me?
Go ahead, Sylvester, you go first and then we'll turn to Meiying.
Yeah, like I said, raised in the community, worked at the Post-Dispatch. My whole focus has always been on the African-American community. So to be able to, and again, I moved into the 6106 neighborhood a year before COVID. So I knew that there were no grocery stores in the neighborhood. I knew that the whole neighborhood depended on this big gas station that cashed checks, that sold food, that sold hair care products. And I go to that gas station. So, again, I think COVID gave us a chance to really, like you said, step outside our professional barriers and be human, to be able to tell the stories that not only impact us, but impact people who look like us, who make the same kind of money that we do, who don't have car insurance, who don't have health insurance. So yeah, I was very fortunate to be broke and to be among the people that I was reporting on.
Meiying?
And for me, I mean, because I was actually in China early 2020, and I just traveled back to the US for my last semester at UC Berkeley. When I started doing this story, I think back of my experience traveling during when China already had the outbreak, and also thinking about my own experience contacting my family back in China every day and learning what they are experiencing. So when I talk to the sources, I ask them, do you still have family members in China? Do you talk to them? How often do you talk to them? What did you learn from their experience? And that usually led to what we found out and put into the story as well. And also sometimes in reporting and writing the news articles, we need to fact check multiple times, and being able to explain that process in Mandarin and in Cantonese to the sources really helped build that trust. We actually went back to them several times asking, which day did you receive this flyer, and when did you hang up it on the wall, and details like that, and that explained to them why those are important to our readers.
Thank you so much. Let's take some questions from the audience. I have so much more I can ask, but I want to give folks in the audience an opportunity. If you'd like, please use your raise hand function, and I will scroll through in gallery view and look for you. And then when I call on you, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself first before you ask your question. We have a shy crowd. All right, in that case, let me go back to David Barstow and Berkeley. David, the Dean, Gita Anand, just sent out a letter to the community with some really interesting statistics on where Berkeley journalism is going, your graduates, where they are off to, and also your incoming class. Can you say a little bit about that and what that is signaling about the direction of the school?
Yeah, I mean, I think the school, but first of all, I think it's probably a good moment, obviously, to note the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, and that had an enormous impact on Berkeley journalism, and it accelerated something that both Gita and I had already been working on. At the time, actually, Gita was working with me in the investigative reporting program when George Floyd was killed, and not long after, and Gita writes about this quite movingly in this incredible note that she sent out yesterday describing what's happening at Berkeley Journalism. She felt like this was a moment to step forward and try to accelerate the effort to transform Berkeley journalism, and especially focus on reaching out and making journalism education a more affordable, and for especially first-gen students and students of color. This has been obviously one of the really big problems in journalism, is that there are a lot of families that can't even contemplate sending their kid to journalism school, and then we don't have those voices. There was a wonderful comment in the chat section here, like who and the point's been made today that who tells the stories matters so much, and the familiarity with these communities matters so much. And so what's interesting is that students are really, I think our students are responding incredibly well to this effort to transform the entire point of Berkeley journalism to being this kind of instrument for changing the face of journalism. And we've had this huge increase in applications. And we have one of our, I think our largest class ever is coming next year. And it's an incredibly diverse class. It's one of the things that drew me to Berkeley was it's a very diverse campus, but that diversity has increased significantly just in the last year or so. I think we're now roughly half of our students are students of color. I'm sure it won't surprise anybody here that probably, I think roughly 2/3 of our students are women. And, of the 93 students that the IRP has helped publish over the last year plus, easily 2/3 are published by women, and nearly half are by students of color. And there's a reason why that matters so much, because as we all know, the currency of the realm to get a job, your first job in journalism, is a great clip, right? Is a set of great clips. And our ability to help our students produce and publish clips that put, Daniel is on the front page of the New York Times. He also, by the way, will be on the front page of the LA Times, which is an incredible achievement. It's one reason why everybody in the country should be rushing to hire Daniel and Meiying. I'm going to try to hold them as long as I can. But those, those are the kinds of things that can meaningfully move the needle, not just in investigative reporting, but actually throughout journalism. And it's one of the reasons why Berkeley Journalism, I think, is an incredibly exciting, vibrant place to be. And we're seeing the results day in and day out. I had a student on the front page of USA Today just a couple of days ago, and on it goes.
Thank you. No, it's very exciting what you're doing over there with Gita and others there. I want to turn to Mary Stuckey, who has a question. Mary, introduce yourself first.
Okay, I'm Mary Stuckey. I direct the Round Earth Media program of the International Women's Media Foundation. This has been great. Just to hear about the collaborations in my long career, to see the changes you're talking about, Kathy, and to see the great reporting. I just want to throw something out and kind of get the reaction from those who've been working most directly, like David, with these young journalists. We wouldn't have this reporting if we don't have the journalists. And talking about COVID, you know, we saw at the IWMF the horrific impact COVID was having on the financial situation of freelancers, especially. We started a COVID relief fund that gave, I think, something like $500,000 to 350 journalists, primarily freelancers and journalists of color, who were the most vulnerable. So we all go hand in hand. And that's just really what I wanted to throw out there. It's so important to have the reporting, but you can't have the reporting without the journalists. And COVID has really we've taken a big hit because of this. So many assignments were canceled, especially freelancers. And I know you all know that, but we're all doing this together. And thanks, Kathy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. I mean, I think, you know, somebody brought it up, I think it was Valentina earlier, the pressures on the press and journalists, and the, you know, whether it was an authoritarian government or not, just the lack of access to accurate information from government agencies was one thing. The kind of crackdown on the press and limitations put on the press during protests in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, all of this, all of the restrictions and harassment and challenges to press freedom is another big issue. And that might be the topic of the next jam session. Let me bring in Lolly Bowen here. She has her hand up.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you for this wonderful conversation. I'd like to direct my question to David, and maybe Meiying could comment as well. David, when you talked about feeding content and stories, you mentioned a number of large mainstream legacy newspapers like the LA Times, the New York Times, and USA Today. I'm curious as to how you are shaping students to be interested in going into new media, to ethnic media, and to community media. So I'm thinking of, for example, Capital B, which is a startup that's going to cover the Black community, but will also need really well educated, intrepid journalists. So I wonder what you're doing to sort of feed into those organizations and sort of shift the focus from legacy news organizations that have gotten so many of the pearls of journalism in terms of journalism stars and journalism students already.
That is such a great question. And it's so funny because I just met in New York last week with a brand new startup news operation that is by a couple of extremely young journalists who want to focus on New York State government. And so my roots are actually in local, like I came up as a local, through local reporting, and I shouldn't have left the misimpression that our students are only getting published in the big legacy media. Our students are being published in lots of local and smaller and newer outlets. In part because you're absolutely right? I mean, journalism, in some ways, right? Probably the New York Times needs our students the least, and you know, some of these newer news outlets, especially the outlets that are focusing on these marginalized communities, could really use our help more. So we have we've just formed a new collaboration with Open Vallejo, which is a brand new news outlet that's focused on the city of Vallejo, not far from Berkeley. We have two local newsrooms that we run ourselves, one focusing on the city of Richmond and the other focusing on Oakland. We actually work with Mission Local. We had a student work all year long with Mission Local that Marina mentioned a little while ago. And I think that is such a hugely important point that you're making, Lolly, about the need for collaboration to especially reach out to support and lift up the newer players, and especially the players who are taking these incredible risks and are trying things that are so difficult to do, to start up a news organization covering some of these communities. I spend much of my time working with editors of all different size news organizations, trying to figure out how our students can contribute meaningfully to the journalism being produced by these entities. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Lolly. And Marina, let me turn to you for the final question before we wrap up. The Pulitzer Center has been supporting freelance and independent journalists for 10 years. And you've also, mostly focused on international, but have shifted to do some more domestic work as well. Any trends that you're noticing from those reporters that are coming to you for financial support, and any patterns that you yourselves are hoping to instill in the field as you make those funding decisions?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of introspection at the Pulitzer Center. The Pulitzer Center started as an organization that would support journalists who wanted to be foreign correspondents, initially 15 years ago when the bureaus were closing everywhere. And that mission has evolved today to really support great enterprise reporting anywhere where it's happening. And that means local reporting anywhere in the world. We've been trying to be very intentional about thinking about our power as a funder, where we stand in the journalism ecosystem, and how the way we structure our grants can really call the better angels of journalism or do the opposite. So that's why when we say we put collaboration at the center of our COVID response, we literally made it a requirement in the grant because we thought that, we don't tell our journalists that we support what to report on, but we can encourage practices that lead to more equitable reporting partnerships and that lead to more representation, which ultimately is our goal as a journalism support organization. So we are expanding our partnerships with all kinds of organizations. We have now a grant with Diversify Photo, which is called Eyewitness, and is specifically for journalists who have been underrepresented in the American media. We started with photographers. Maybe in the future we can expand it also to other forms of journalism, but very much trying to be intentional about what diversity, equity, and inclusion means, and also not assuming that journalists know how to get to us, that journalists know that this support is there for them, or that they can qualify for it. When we talk to underrepresented reporters, what they tell us is like, it never occurred to me that I could even be considered for a grant. So we are trying to demystify the process and to tear down barriers, both in the United States and in countries around the world.
Thanks, Marina. Well, it's just about time to wrap up. And I want to thank our panelists, and I want to encourage all of you to follow Valentina and Meiying and Daniel and Sylvester. Follow their work and support their work and give them some love. I want to thank grantees at Berkeley Journalism and the Pulitzer Center for their excellent and courageous work. We are so proud, and it's such a privilege to support you. The work that you are doing is making journalism, the profession, better and more impactful, and we are so grateful for that. Thank you everyone for coming. We hope to have more of these jam sessions with other MacArthur grantees, so please stay tuned and join us next time. Thank you all for coming.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.